Welcome everyone to the weekly CDDRL seminar, one of the final ones of the quarter. We are delighted to have with us today Jim Goldgeier, who's a visiting scholar at Stanford's Center for International Security and Cooperation, a visiting fellow at the Brookings Institution, and a professor of international relations at the School of International Service at American University, where he served as dean from 2011 to 2017. He's a past president of the Association of Professional Schools of International Affairs and is a senior advisor to the Bridging the Gap initiative, which was funded by the Carnegie Corporation of New York and the Raymond Frankel Foundation. He serves as co-editor of the Bridging the Gap book series at Oxford University Press and has authored or co-authored 4 books. He'll be speaking today on the topic of NATO enlargement, and we are delighted he can join us.
Thank you. Thanks everybody for having me. You can hear me okay? You don't mind if I'm masked? Let me know if you're having trouble hearing what I'm saying. So several years ago, I called Josh Shifrinson, who is currently a professor at Boston University, about to move to the University of Maryland, and who I knew had a very different view of NATO enlargement than I do. I have long believed that it was the right policy to pursue, and I knew that he did not. And I said to him, you know, the debate over NATO enlargement is terrible. It's, you know, you've got on the one hand, people arguing, you know, it's the original sin, it's the worst foreign policy decision ever made, it's the cause of everything bad in the US-Russia relationship. And then you have people on the other side saying, you know, it was all good, fantastic policy, don't know why the Russians never, you know, could accept it, and there's really no issue whatsoever. And I said to him, you know, I mean, obviously the policy had benefits and costs, and the only way to really evaluate it is to compare it to alternatives, and to think about what the costs and benefits to those alternatives would be. And since you don't like enlargement, and I do, if we could agree on how to evaluate it, that would be a great service, I think. It'd make me feel better about the debate. And so that's what we've done. And we still disagree on the merits, but we agreed on how to evaluate. So basically, the reason we could agree was we agree on what the costs and benefits of the policy were. We just weigh the costs and benefits differently. And I think, I mean, you know, I teach at a public policy school, international affairs school. You've got the program here, the Masters in International Policy. I just think we should be doing more of this effort to analyze policy and think about how you analyze a policy compared to its alternatives when we meet with our students. So anyway, the conversation led to a special issue of the journal International Politics, which appeared in 2020. We had about a dozen pieces. We had our framing piece, and then we had 11 other pieces in the volume. We had 4 pieces on the US-Russia relationship, taking very different views of it. We had pieces on Central and Eastern Europe. We had pieces on NATO as an institution. What did enlargement mean for NATO as an institution? And so I think we had a good range. We focused, and I'm going to focus this talk on what I call the NATO-centric alternatives. That is, all the alternatives I'm going to speak about are NATO related. There are other policies that theoretically could have been pursued, like a focus on an EU security framework or a focus on what became the OSCE. But we don't focus on that because once the United States made the decision that it was going to stick with NATO and wanted NATO to remain the central security institution in Europe, that really foreclosed other institutions. In the United States, in the HW administration, at the very end of the Cold War, worked hard to ensure that the EU was not going to emerge as a security institution that would rival NATO. And this was really all because of the US desire to remain the dominant actor in European security. So, okay, so there were three main NATO-centric alternatives to the policy that was chosen. One was to focus on the Partnership for Peace that was announced at the NATO summit in January of 1994, and leave enlargement for some kind of distant future. The second was to invite Russia to join. And a third was to pursue some of the enlargement that was chosen, but not as much as occurred. And I think it's really important to understand when we say NATO enlargement, it's not like one thing. The first three new members after the end of the Cold War come in March of 1999, Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic. You have the Big Bang, the 7, including the Baltics, that come in 2004. You have the variety of small little countries that come in after that in the Balkans. And then, of course, hopefully within the next year, Sweden and Finland will join. So let me go through these alternatives. Partnership for Peace. The Partnership for Peace, as developed in 1993 at the Pentagon, was the preferred policy of the Department of Defense. And there were two main, and the Partnership for Peace, the idea behind Partnership for Peace was it would include all members of the former Warsaw Pact and the former Soviet Union. So all of them would be members of the Partnership for Peace. And the basic idea behind PFP was that the one institution that could mess up the reform process in these countries, the democratic reform process, was the military. And so establishing military-to-military ties between NATO and these countries would facilitate the process of democratic reform in these countries. And there were two big concerns at DoD. For the Joint Chiefs, the main two big concerns about NATO enlargement from the proponents of PFP. The proponents of PFP saw Partnership for Peace as an alternative to NATO enlargement, not as a pathway. Eventual pathway, like way, but mainly as an alternative. One Joint Chiefs complaint about enlargement was new security guarantees. If you're going to bring these countries in, they had an Article 5 security guarantee. Now, for most people in the early to mid 90s, and I would say if you look at the Senate debate on ratification in 1997, security guarantees for most people were an afterthought. Like, defend them from what? So it wasn't really thought of as a major issue. But it was if you were at the Pentagon. I mean, that was your responsibility. If they came in, you were going to have to figure out how you were going to defend them. And the argument was, everybody's talking about peace dividend, talking about reducing the defense budget. How could you talk about reducing the defense budget and adding new security guarantees for new countries? And the other, primarily from Bill Perry and Ash Carter at the Pentagon, was the impact on arms control. If you pursue enlargement with the Russians, that's going to get in the way of arms control. And it is the case that you don't have a major nuclear arms agreement during the Clinton-Yeltsin years. So what about thinking about assessing, okay, what about PFP as an alternative? Well, it would have made relations with Russia much easier. There's no question about it. And you can tell that when you look at the memorandum of conversation between Warren Christopher, Secretary of State, and Boris Yeltsin, the Russian president, in October of 1993, when Christopher told Yeltsin, Partnership for Peace is what's going to be announced at the NATO summit in January. A palpable sense of relief from Boris Yeltsin, who kept asking Christopher for clarification. You mean nobody's going to be pushed ahead of anybody else? There's not even going to be associate membership status. And as Yeltsin said to Christopher, tell Bill it's brilliant. So relieved. what would have been the cost? I think it would have been really hard to tell the Central and Eastern European countries that they couldn't join. I'm really not sure how you really could have done this over an extended period of time. First of all, there's the issue that NATO has built into the treaty of 1949, Article 10, which opens the door to other European countries that can meet the criteria and contribute to alliance security. And that's what was used to enlarge NATO during the Cold War. Greece and Turkey in 1952, West Germany in 1955, and Spain in 1982. So on what grounds would you have said to come? I mean, again, it's really important to remember, NATO enlargement wasn't forced on anyone. I mean, on what grounds could you have said to Central and Eastern Europeans wanting to come into NATO, you know what, Joseph Stalin drew a line in 1945 and you're just going to be stuck with that. I think that would have been really very difficult to do. Politically, it would have been very difficult because, as Bill Clinton told Boris Yeltsin in 1995, as they were discussing the upcoming 1996 elections, both Yeltsin's reelection and Clinton's reelection, that there were important voters. There were voters in important states like Wisconsin, Ohio, and Illinois, as Clinton said to Yeltsin. There were other states as well, where there were voters of Central and Eastern European descent who would have been pretty unhappy if the countries like Poland had been told that they couldn't join NATO. I think politically it would have been very difficult. And the Republicans were very eager to take advantage of any kind of missteps on enlargement. And it's also not just the US. It was very important for the German Ministry of Defense, for example, that the eastern border of NATO not be the eastern border of Germany. And if we look at the situation today, I think that view that they had, that it would be better if the border was further east, the NATO border was further east, I think that's been borne out. So I think it would have been hard to do PFP and say, forget it on NATO. All right, second would be, well, like, let's ease the whole issue with Russia and just invite Russia to join NATO. I mean, that'll take care of the problem right there. So the issue of Russia joining NATO, as preposterous as it might sound to you, was discussed on and off between 1991 and 2001. 2001 is the latest that I know of that was discussed. I just mentioned Article 10. Article 10 opens the door to any European state that can meet the criteria and contribute to alliance security. So it's very important for the Clinton administration to maintain that open door for all European countries, including Russia. And the Russians were told repeatedly, the door is open to you, depending on your interest and your ability to meet it. Like I said, you can argue this was preposterous, but it was stated at various points. I should say the most dramatic moment with respect to this issue was in fact in December of 1991 at the meeting of the North Atlantic Cooperation Council, the meeting of NATO with all of these countries that were becoming independent. The Soviet ambassador asked to be excused from the meeting, came back and said, I no longer represent the Soviet Union, I represent the Russian Federation. And the president of the Russian Federation, Boris Yeltsin, would like for Russia to join NATO. So as I said, you've got the open door, being stated. Yeltsin, every once in a while would express his interest in NATO membership. And Putin, when he came into power, also expressed his interest in NATO membership. And as I said, the last time I know of that there was any serious discussion was in the summer of 2001, after Putin had once again talked about potential Russian membership. There was a memo prepared at the policy planning staff at the State Department In 2001, Richard Haas, the director of policy planning, asked Angela Stent on the staff to draft a memo, which Angela mentions in her book, The Limits of Partnership. I filed a FOIA request to get this and would love to actually see it, but it was basically, as she describes it, it's time to invite Russia to join. And the argument was, it would mean a very different NATO, but that's fine. It's time for that and time to have time to have Russia in. Now, of course, it would have been very hard to absorb Russia into NATO. You have the long border, the long Russian border with China. I mean, again, you do have defense Article 5 in these countries. And I also think, of course, it would have been hard because of the Russian attitudes toward the Central and Eastern Europeans, which continues today with, of course, their attitude toward Ukraine. I mean, you got to accept, if you're the Russian government, until you can accept that these other countries are independent, deserve to be independent, and are legitimately independent, and that they don't belong to you, it's kind of hard to fit into any of these things. And, Putin really was not going to be a good NATO partner, as it turns out. But of course, it would have taken the issue of enlargement as anti-Russian off the table. Final alternative, some enlargement, but not as much. The first round really wasn't that challenging. Poland, Hungary, the Czech Republic, the Russians didn't love it, but they, it wasn't gonna break the relationship. Second round, a little more challenging because you had the Baltic countries coming in, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. Leaving them out would have made them extremely vulnerable. And I know from talking to a lot of realist scholars that, whenever I say, think about what would have happened if they hadn't come into NATO, and, they would look a lot like Moldova, Georgia, Ukraine. And, often the answer is, but so what, from an American perspective? So I suppose, it does depend on what you think is important from the perspective of American interests. I happen to feel like the more security and stability in Europe, the better. And I don't think it's a good thing for American security interests to have more vulnerable countries. But, and even that second round, I think, was accepted by the Russians. They seem to have accommodated. So when we look at NATO enlargement as a policy over time, I would argue the real issue is the 2008 Bucharest Declaration, saying that Ukraine and Georgia will become members of NATO. This was an enormous mistake, in my view. Not just because of the relationship with Russia, but just because of what it meant for the process of enlargement. For those who don't know, so in 2008, the George W. Bush administration wanted to provide what are called membership action plans for Ukraine and Georgia. This would have put them on a formal path to membership, basically with the membership action plan, which was developed after the first round. After the first round of enlargement in '99, the idea was, we sort of had an ad hoc, set of issues of what these countries had to do to get in. Mainly really having to do with their commitment to democracy, respect for human rights, rule of law, everything that makes CGDRL what it is. And the idea was, we should really create something a little more formal. So the membership action plan was created. It was used for the '04 round. And the Bush administration wanted to do this for Ukraine and Georgia. The French and Germans said no, because of their concern about what it would mean for the relationship with Russia. And so in the most, it was so bad that this compromise was forged to have this language about Ukraine and Georgia that will become members. Eva Dalder and I wrote a piece the following week, came out the following week after the Bucharest summit, called A Mockery of Enlargement. Basically the argument was, and remains, that the whole point of the membership action plan was to say to countries, look, here's what you would have to do if you wanted to become a member of NATO. And when you've done all those things, we will then take the decision as to whether or not you should be invited to join. That was the process. The process wasn't to just say, well, forget that, you'll be a member. So it made a mockery of the process by prejudging whether or not these countries would be able to meet the criteria. And then, of course, all it did was really tick off the Russians. So, put these countries, there was no path for them to join. So you antagonized the Russians, you created no path for these countries to join. And I think this was the mistake of the enlargement process. My own view, thus, is that enlargement, absent the Bucharest Declaration, was the right approach to European security. Just as a reminder, we did not force enlargement on these countries. They wanted to join, and rightfully so. I think that that's been made pretty clear in the last few months. Thank goodness for these countries that they are in NATO. Enlargement did, of course, though, it did it contributed to the deterioration of relations with Russia. So you have to, if you're a supporter of enlargement, you do have to acknowledge that it contributed to the deterioration of relations with Russia. I don't think you just avoid saying that. But it wasn't the only issue that did. First round, 1994, the Kosovo War was much more important than enlargement for the deterioration of relations. Yeltsin's reaction, if you look at all the memorandum of conversation that have been posted on the Clinton Presidential Library website, the discussions on Kosovo are way more difficult than the discussions on NATO. Second round, 2004, the color revolutions were a much bigger deal than the second round of NATO enlargement, especially because of the way Putin views these kinds of processes, right? The people on the ground have no agency. They couldn't possibly actually want this. They are driven to this by the United States, which is, fostering all this stuff. So a much bigger deal. So part of the reason why I am a supporter of enlargement, as I weigh the cost and benefits, is I don't believe relations with Russia would look that different absent enlargement. So to me, the benefits of what it meant to Central and Eastern Europe and security across the region outweigh the costs that have been involved in the policy. That is a tough counterfactual to run. There were so many other issues that contributed to the downturn in relations. From the NATO side, the US, there was Kosovo, there was the US unilateral withdrawal from the ABM treaty, there was the Iraq war, and the ignoring of the UN Security Council. So Kosovo and Iraq, within 4 years of each other, and in neither case, of course, going to the UN Security Council. Problem for Russia. The Libya war, and then, of course, all the things that Putin has done at home and his attitudes toward the neighbors. There were lots of things to get in the way of a better relationship between Russia and the West. To those who argue, well, you didn't really need NATO enlargement for Central and Eastern Europe, EU enlargement would have done the trick, that would have, gotten the reform in these countries. They would have come into the EU. And so you didn't really need NATO enlargement for the objective of reform, in political and economic reform in these countries. That may have been true, but I would ask you to consider whether you think the EU would have enlarged absent NATO enlargement. I don't think it would have. Helmut Kohl told Strobe Talbot that EU would not have enlarged if it hadn't been for NATO enlargement, because NATO enlargement gave the EU the confidence that there would be security and stability across this area. I can't imagine the 3 Baltic countries could have come into the European Union if they hadn't been coming into NATO as well. And I do think that NATO enlargement did help move countries toward democracy. For example, civilian control over the military in Poland, I think, came about to a large extent because of the need for Poland to ensure civilian control over the military in order to pursue membership. So Partnership for Peace, I think, wasn't enough for the Central and Eastern Europeans. Inviting Russia to join was too much of a stretch. Enlargement did create security and stability across Europe while contributing to the deterioration of relations with Russia. And I think if NATO had done the first two rounds and then, the other smaller stuff that's done since then, and not issue the Bucharest Declaration, I think that would have led us to a much more positive assessment of the overall policy. Even though, as I said, I support the policy, the last piece, I think, was unwise. And just finally, for those who complain about NATO provoking Russia, NATO made a tremendous effort to reach out to Russia, to reassure it. The Founding Act, the 1997 Founding Act, laid out, the NATO effort that, NATO wasn't going to introduce nuclear weapons into these countries. It wasn't going to permanently station forces. It wasn't going to, add infrastructure in these countries. I mean, it really was trying to reassure Russia that this was not directed against Russia. And in my view, the main issue at the end of the day is the Russian leadership's unwillingness to view the independence and sovereignty of its neighbors as legitimate. And I believe that we shouldn't feel like we have to accommodate Russian imperialism. So.
Great.
Stop there.
That's perfect. Thanks so much. So yeah, questions, please go ahead. So I'll go ahead and start. And if you have a question, go ahead and raise your hand and I'll add you to the list. There are some people who have more boldly said that the Bucharest Declaration drew a direct line to aggression today, Russian aggression. And I know you're not going that far, but what do you also think in the meantime of the sort of retreat of global democracy, both in Russia, which you alluded to, but also in the United States or more broadly in the liberal world order? I know the purpose of NATO is not to be a democracy organization per se, but how do you think that that has interacted with since 2008? And then I have Steve. Oh, yes, please.
Yeah, like I said, the Bucharest Declaration was a mistake. I think primarily it gave Putin an excuse to do things he wanted to do. The fact of the matter is neither Ukraine nor Georgia was on a path to membership, and they weren't going to be on the path to membership, and everyone knew they weren't going to become members. I think one of the big, it's interesting, one of the big issues for NATO
Except them.
is that
Except them.
the accept. And which is my next point is connected to that, which is one of the issues about the way NATO works is, it's an organization that operates by consensus. The 2008 language was the consensus language. So that means that every document since then, every NATO statement, every NATO summit declaration, every time a NATO Secretary General met with Ukrainians or Georgians, what's the consensus language? Ukraine and Georgia will become members of NATO. So it got repeated. It wasn't just like it was issued in 2008 and then people said, let's not talk about it. It got repeated in every document after that, and it will until NATO decides that there's new language that it should agree on at 30 or 32. And so that's the problem of the kind of expectations that it created in those two countries. It's certainly, irritated. Again, every time that statement was made, it just was another irritant for the Russians. But I really don't think we can I don't think we can provide any excuse for what Putin has done in Ukraine. I just think, you know, he made his views on Ukraine known long before the Bucharest Declaration. It's not a real country, you know, this is part of Russia. It's part of his vision for Russia. So it gave him an excuse, but I don't think, you know, I just don't see it as the cause. I think the cause was his own vision of how he conceived of Russia. And, you know, Catherine is more of an expert than I on this, so I would defer to her, but I just think
As should everyone on all things.
Do what?
As should everyone on all.
It just gives, I just think, you know, that the reason, and, you know, so then the question is why now? And that's a whole nother discussion.
Okay.
I mean, the democracy issue is super important because, you know, we talked about how important it was for NATO to say, you know, these are the things you've got to do if you want to become a member, and commitment to democracy, rule of law, respect for human rights, and so on, as all being a part of that. The one, I mean, I will say this as somebody who saw this unfold in the 90s and thought, you know, what a great thing for Central and Eastern Europe. I must say, it didn't really occur to me that these countries would then move in a different direction after they came. I mean, it really wasn't in my thought process. Oh yeah, but you know, sometime down the road, like Hungary under Viktor Orban, who was a very different Viktor Orban in the early 90s, it's going to become an authoritarian state. Poland is going to be restricting media freedoms and independence of the judiciary. Of course, it also wasn't on my radar screen that the United States would go in the direction that it has and that we would have January 6th. So, I mean, this is a crisis, and NATO is, at its heart, it should be a club of democracies. I mean, it's very clear in the original NATO treaty, the preamble and the treaty, that, you know, the principles are important, and that is an issue that NATO is going to have to address.
I have Steve and then Catherine.
So, I mean, I also agree with sort of where we are now, and the idea that, you know, there's a cause in 2008 where you get the effect of an invasion in 2022 seems stretched. And I also agree that this has nothing to do with that invasion. So a comment and then a question. The comment is that, and I'm not clear if you were saying this just in the presentation, or whether it's in the written, because when you're trying to assess costs and benefits, I found it a little alarming that you smuggled in domestic politics into why we can't have Russian expansion. It's going to hurt Clinton, you know, with ethnic voters in the election in 1996. That doesn't fit into any kind of realist, no IR, American national interest paradigm, right? You've smuggled domestic politics in there. I don't know if that's in the article and stuff, where you're just saying that as a practical matter, Clinton wasn't going to do this because it hurt him. That's different, right? The question I have is on Partnership for Peace. What happened to Russia and Partnership for Peace, right? Were they in Partnership for Peace during Kosovo? Wasn't that one of the ways that the whole confrontation between the Russian paratroopers into Kosovo, that whole confrontation was de-escalated, was basically by saying, oh, I'm glad you're here because you're part of the Partnership for Peace. And so if that's true, then I'd say that the Partnership for Peace actually is pretty valuable in stopping what could have been a hot incident in Kosovo. But I just actually don't know what happened to Russia and PFP.
Okay, so first of all, if I gave you that impression about what I meant by the domestic politics argument, so the domestic politics argument was not about Russia joining. The domestic politics argument was about the difficulty of telling Central and Eastern European countries that they couldn't join NATO. And I don't see how you have a discussion of NATO enlargement without recognizing the political challenges that would have resulted from telling these countries that they couldn't join. I mean, it was the issue of the Central and Eastern Europeans was an important one for Clinton's victory in 1992. The campaign very successfully used George H.W. Bush's perceived slowness regarding the trends in Central and Eastern Europe and in the Soviet Union to reach out to voters who had voted Republican in the 80, 84, and 88 elections. And Clinton was not about to lose those voters in the 96 election. And, so the way in which enlargement unfolded was basically Clinton made clear to Yeltsin that nothing concrete was going to happen before Yeltsin's reelection in July of 96. But he was going to make sure he did something concrete before his own election in November. And it is not an accident that he announced NATO, the fact that NATO was going to meet in 1997 to issue invitations. It's not an accident that he made that announcement in Hamtramck, Michigan in October of 1996 before a Polish-American audience. I mean, we could pretend as scholars of international relations that domestic politics don't matter, but I think the domestic politics were an important feature of this, and it was important because of the way in which the Central and Eastern Europeans pursued enlargement. And in fact, their own pursuit of enlargement involved them being very active. I mean, the Polish ambassador in the United States was very active in the United States in reaching out to Polish-American voters to elicit their support for NATO enlargement. When Joe Biden said that his constituents in Delaware didn't care about NATO enlargement, the Polish ambassador reached out to Polish-American on the Wilmington City Council and got a resolution passed in support of NATO enlargement. So
my point wasn't that these things didn't matter in terms of the narrative that you're giving. It's just that where you started was, can we all just agree on costs and benefits? And can we just give a realistic assessment of costs and benefits? And the costs and benefits are to who? And by smuggling domestic politics in, it's costs and benefits to President Bill Clinton in his re-election as opposed to the American national interest.
Right. Okay.
The two are not mutually exclusive.
All right,
I have a
two fingers,
yeah. So
He wrote this, it's all his fault. He was in the Clinton administration.
my memory, Jim, is that in the one-on-one electoral politics with that degree of specificity did not surface. That is, I'd have to go back and check my notes, but I don't remember explicit reference on our side to voters in particular states. What I do remember is it's an election year for both of us. We have domestic constituencies across the spectrum who feel one way or the other about this. And the admission that Bill Clinton, felt strongly about getting the politics of this right for him. So you have to be kind of a dope not to figure out what he's referring to, but it was a little more subtle than that.
So just on that, thankfully the Clinton Library has declassified everything.
Right.
And I think it was May of 95. I've written on this, so I think that's when this discussion took place. Yeltsin said, you got to understand, I'm getting hammered, the nationalists, this is going to be a real problem for me. And Clinton did say, I got my own domestic politics,
right.
And he did mention Wisconsin.
That one is less dispositive to me than Hyde Park. So Hyde Park was a little, that's also when Clinton said to him, wrapped up in this is, as you will recall, Boris, this is an election year, not just
Right.
for you, but that whole spiel.
Right,
The door to Russian membership remains open.
right,
He said that
right,
explicitly.
yes.
And that wasn't in the talking points. We talked about that afterwards. It's kind of like what he said about Chechnya, right? Well, we have our own experience with civil war.
Right.
No,
Right.
don't go there, please. But I don't remember in Hyde Park. And that may be one of those times when we suggested to him that probably wasn't the best way to talk about it. But I'd forgotten about the May exchange. Actually, I'd have to go back and check.
Can I answer the PFP?
Please, and then we
Is
have,
that okay?
of course.
Okay. So it was a big deal for Russia to join Partnership for Peace. I mean, that wasn't easy getting Russia into Partnership for Peace. They did agree to join. Also important to know, I think it's also important to note other features of what occurred in the 90s, especially given the role that Bill Perry played. In 1995, with the very clever solution to have Russia participate in the implementation force after the signing of the Dayton Accords in Bosnia. And that wasn't easy. There were a lot of people in the US administration who were like, what on earth do we need Russia in this for? I mean, this is just added, irritation. And Perry was like, this is the most important thing in European security happening, and you got to include the Russians. And the question was how to do it, because it was a NATO operation. And it was a very clever solution, which was the Russians would be reporting to, the Supreme Allied Commander of Europe, the American general, is both an American general and the Supreme Allied Commander for the NATO forces. So the Russians would be reporting to him as an American, not reporting to NATO. And, and you had the Permanent Joint Council, which was created in 1997 in the Founding Act, which was this idea of having this body that would be a way for NATO and Russia to address challenges. What later became the NATO-Russia Council in the Bush administration. And in my view, what Kosovo showed, just as Georgia would in 2008 as well, is that at the precise moment you really needed this kind of institution to work was when it wasn't going to work, right? The Russians, Yeltsin said, we're out of this thing because he was so angry about Kosovo. So it didn't serve as a mechanism. And the US said the same thing in 2008 after the onset of the Russian-Georgia war. So there wasn't really that ability to have a crisis management mechanism. And on Kosovo, the Kosovo situation with the Russians at the Pristina airport was extremely dangerous. And it was made more dangerous by the actions of General Wes Clark. And I don't think it would have been resolved successfully if it hadn't been for the British general, General Jackson, who told Wes Clark, I'm not starting World War III for you. It was an extremely dangerous situation. So.
All right, Catherine.
Hi, Jim. Thanks for coming all the way down from CSEC to see us. It's great to have this mixing of points of view and topics. So great talk, and obviously I rely on you for all of this stuff more than me, although it's in my focus, So a couple of questions. First of all, as I think about the current invasion of Ukraine and then also 2014 and even the Georgian war, which of course Medvedev was president when that happened. So how much of this is structural? So talking a bit more about Yeltsin, I suppose, and I'm particularly interested in hearing from Chip, you were senior director in the National Security Council at the time for Russia and the Commonwealth of Independent States. Is that what?
RUE.
RUE.
Russia,
Ukraine,
Eurasia.
Right, it keeps changing.
Didn't change on that.
Right, okay. Over history.
Right.
So I'd be interested, because you were right in there at the time. So first of all, there was a fourth option that you didn't mention, right? You said partnership for peace, invite Russia to join or pursue enlargement, but not as it happened. The fourth would be, of course, don't enlarge or get rid of NATO completely, right? So get rid of NATO was a fourth option, not on the table. So could that have been something considered? Would we be in the same situation or worse now? And I guess I want to challenge the idea that it is structural or inevitable that Russia would come back under a different president, not Putin. Let's say Boris Nemtsov had become president, not Putin, and that was an option for Yeltsin. Would any of this have happened? I mean, we have a very specific kind of person with this background and view of the world, who has surrounded himself with other people who have a similar background and view of the world. And just judging from public opinion polls currently on the invasion, and then earlier and just more generally, young Russians under 35, they would not have done this, right? So it suggests to me it's not structural or inevitable. They don't think this is the right thing to do. So, could we under Yeltsin have just gotten rid of NATO and this might not, none of this would have happened, or was that just too dangerous, given in the context of World War II?
Yes, so let me just, and I'd be interested in Chip's thoughts on this. So the reason I start with what I call the NATO-centric alternatives is just, I take as my starting point the US decision at the end of the Cold War that NATO was going to continue. I mean, in the George H.W. Bush administration, when there was talk in the air, including for people like Václav Havel, that we should just get rid of NATO, and we should, and then it was the CSCE, but that we should just focus on that, or discussions in Europe about, well, we don't need NATO, we can just use the EU. I mean, the H.W. Bush administration was like, okay, like we got to make sure that doesn't happen. I would argue, for those who think that this was some nefarious thing, I would argue that it was their reading of history, which was basically boiled down to post-1919 bad, post-1945 good, which is, look what happens, after 1919, US leaves, World War II 2 decades later. 1945, US stays, look what prosperous Western Europe, secure Western Europe. We cannot leave Europe. If we do, it's just going to go bad again. The only way for us to stay is through NATO. We're not a member of the European Union. And OSCE, we don't, I mean, it just wasn't really enough. I mean, at that time, it wasn't enough. So that's why I argue once they made the decision that they were going to continue NATO as the way to ensure US continued to play the leading role in European security, then to me, that's why it's like, okay, then what were the alternatives to the policy that was chosen in that world in which NATO remains central? I mean, I would have told you last year, I did tell people last year, we shouldn't have to think the same way 30 years later that we did then. I mean, the Europeans should be able to take more of this on, but I fear now that we will be more deeply engaged than ever. And just, when I said that I don't think relations with Russia would look that different absent NATO enlargement, when I say that, I'm taking as a given the person who became president 22 years ago and has continued since then. I mean, I do think, yeah, a different president would make a difference. And I think that's one of the issues for us thinking about the future. I mean, how will we think about Russia in the context of European security, even post-Putin? I mean, we went from the Cold War to the post-Cold War and thought, okay, we're going to find some way to connect Russia to European security. We're going to reach out. We are going to continue NATO, but we're going to find some NATO-Russia mechanism, and we're going to try to reassure the Russians and try to create, bring them in as a responsible partner in Europe. I think that was the whole reason for Perry bringing them into the implementation force after the Dayton Accords were signed, to try to find some way for them in. We're not going to do that now.
Just one factoid on that.
Yeah.
We did not suggest the reporting relationship that you outlined. Grachev did.
Oh, okay.
Interesting.
That is interesting.
Because the normal interpretation is, oh, the Americans came up with this
Right.
great way.
Interesting. Okay.
Perry said, I think we're at loggerheads here. He said this to Grachev. And I don't think we're going to get there. And you're going to have to go back to your president, and I'll have to go back to our president and say, we tried, but we couldn't do it. And Grachev called for a timeout, and he came back and he said, how about if we report to Sakir in his American incarnation? We can live with that. So it's Grachev actually. made a
Interesting.
suggestion.
Thank you.
Our jaws dropped. We didn't expect it. And Perry said, brilliant.
Right. It was brilliant.
It was brilliant.
All
Sorry.
Oh, it's okay. All right, so we have a few other questions. It's Jason, and then the list for now, so raise your hand if you have more after this, is Johannes, Brett, Marissa.
I'll be briefer in my answer. Sorry.
That's okay. Jason.
I'm Jason Brownlee, University of Texas at Austin. Thank you for the talk. I found the framework really useful, and I think considering these counterfactuals is exactly the way to go. But I'm going to kind of come back to an earlier question, because I think the power of the framework is in having some consistent yardstick based on costs and benefits, in which you're evaluating these different decision points and then saying, okay, this was a prudent decision, this was not such a prudent decision. That's your critique of Bucharest 2008. And so the question is, why, when using that same yardstick, are the decisions of the early and mid 1990s considered prudent rather than imprudent? What would the costs have been for the United States of sticking with the Partnership for Peace option? It's clear what the preference ordering will be for Russia or for the Eastern Bloc, but for the United States, it's not clear, other than this gesture to, I guess, hurt feelings in Eastern Europe or these domestic constituencies that might have had some influence on elections, what the political kind of pain or long-term strategic costs are there. And in terms of what you found in the Clinton archives, that is obviously incredibly useful, although I would question the counterfactual that Bob Dole would somehow have been able to outflank Clinton on the campaign trail in the 1996 election based on whether or not Clinton made this announcement that NATO expansion. And if you do gesture to domestic politics and decide to invoke that in kind of an idiosyncratic way, one could say that, well, the jury is out on Bucharest 2008, because once the George W. Bush archives become open and available, we may find that there was some compelling domestic imperative for the administration to follow that.
Yeah, and so, okay. It's also worth noting, I mean, I mentioned NATO, the sort of open door being built in to the alliance as built into the treaty and used during the Cold War to add 4 members to the original 12. So I do think you have to think about, when we think of the sort of broader political context, I think you have to think about the impact on NATO as an institution that has an open door policy built in to say, yes, it's built in, but you can't come in because you were on the wrong side of the Iron Curtain. I think the costs for NATO as an institution would have been extremely high. To say the open door was fine during the Cold War, but you were on the wrong side in 1945, and you're destined to remain there forever. I think and also if you believe as I do that NATO enlargement paved the way for EU enlargement, it becomes even more important in that context, because then because without it, you have a situation where you have these extreme vulnerabilities across Central and Eastern Europe. And I just try to imagine, like, what would Central and Eastern Europe look like if these countries weren't in NATO? I just think there would have been the potential for tremendous insecurity and instability across the region, and I think that would have affected the politics of that region, and you know, the potential for Russian involvement in countries beyond what we've seen. I mean, it is important to say that it is one of the issues with respect to Ukrainian and Georgian membership, which would be taken off the table if Ukraine said, we want to pursue neutrality, we don't want to pursue NATO membership. I mean, it is hard even in those, in my view, even in those cases, to say to countries like Ukraine and Georgia, you know what, yes, NATO has an open door policy. Yes, there's Article 10. Yes, we took these countries in, but you know what, you guys really are unable to, yes, you're a European country, but you know what, you still belong there. I think even that politically is difficult, but there was no reason to do what was done in 2008. And I think that I don't think it was necessary to pursue the membership action plans at that time. Partly, I mean, with respect to Ukraine, I mean, Ukrainian population support for NATO membership didn't even occur till after the 2014 Russian invasion of Ukraine. So I don't think there was a huge amount of need there to do that at that time. And my understanding of the compromise language, but I don't know this for sure, but I have been told this by people working in the government, was that it was Chancellor Merkel who suggested the compromise language because she had told George W. Bush no on the membership action plan. But I don't know for sure the dynamics that led to the language being adopted.
I'm going to group questions for these final 15 minutes. So Brett and Johannes, and please be succinct.
Yeah, I'll be very succinct. So it seems to me that, you know, in some sense, the broader question, kind of the zeitgeist of the moment, I suppose, is what lost Russia, right? I suppose I'm thinking about this in particular in the context of.
I've written like 3 pieces that say who lost Russia over the last 22 years. It's the same answer.
Russians lost Russia.
That's the answer.
Well, then let me sort of put it slightly differently, which is to say, or the other kind of part of it is that, you know, surely we will likely confront this again, right? Perhaps when the CCP falls, perhaps when the Putin regime falls, right? So we're going to ask sort of the same questions about kind of, you know, how to reconstitute the security political relationship between the NATO, et cetera, infrastructure, EU infrastructure, and, you know, kind of the infrastructure you know, against post-CCP, post-Putin. So I'm curious sort of to what extent, or, you know, what lessons we should be drawing, in your view, from this kind of question about, I mean, kind of like what lost Russia, to, you know, how we can avoid losing, you know, post-CCP China, post-Putin.
All right, Johannes.
Well, I think one must not forget in discussing this what the situation really in 1990 was. I was at that time in the Chancellery, and I mean, the idea to dissolve NATO is absolutely unrealistic. I think that would have been uproar everywhere, you know. So this is just theoretical fantasy, or maybe theoretically academic, but not. And one must not forget the key final open point on German reunification was the NATO membership of the wholly reunited Germany. The Chancellor traveled to Moscow, you know, in July, and everything was open because he said to Gorbachev, if the whole of Germany cannot remain member in NATO, then the whole thing is open. I mean, this, so the idea that NATO could have been given up at that time, one must not forget that we came with the experience since 1945, that this was a basis for security for everybody.
But it could have been later, not that moment. Did it happen?
No, it had to be at that
But
moment.
yeah, but it shows, I think, from a European point of view, with all respect for the Americans, they're a little bit further away, but the West who are really at the border. And I remember when I was in the military service, the next Russian division was 50 kilometers away. Well, that's a different experience, So, and we have seen that this has been very successful. And it was clear that this kind of concept would not have been given up, And on the other hand, I admit I was really amazed that the chancellor managed in this meeting in July to convince Gorbachev that the membership of a reunited Germany in NATO is in his interest.
Right.
The point also you made, that we have seen between the two world wars, Germany and other states in the middle of Central Europe not being organized was really a source of insecurity, because nobody knew what would these guys do next day.
That was the argument.
And that's exactly what the political idea of the Western leadership, including the American president, the chancellor, and others, what they wanted at all costs to avoid.
Johannes, can I ask you, were you involved in government in anything having to do with the Bucharest memorandum?
Bucharest was much later.
I know. I'm talking about 2008.
No,
Were you involved in that, or?
No, I was in the chancellery until 1995.
Okay.
And the other point I want to make is, I think I fully agree with your analysis, but there's one point missing, and that is, if you look on the whole thing from a Russian perspective, what is what is the balance for the Russians at the end of the day? They see the Western countries, the NATO is enlarged for good reasons, what you are saying. So, and what I find is that the European Union, on the more economic ground, did not develop really a concept, how to integrate Russia, not in the military sense, but in the economic field. For example, there had been an idea to create some kind of a free trade zone or whatever, So things which would have been attractive, I think, for Russia, which would have given a perspective for future development. And I think personally that the European Union, if you look at all the presidents of the European Commission, following Jacques Delors in the 1990s, one has to be, I think it's, here I can say that, the quality, let's say the fantasy in political design really came back to zero. I don't want to name here the individual, but you must not forget that the heads of government and state, they didn't want really to have somebody at the top of the commission playing the role Jacques Delors played in the 90s. He was the architect, he was the intellectual architect of what happened in the 1990s. And there is, human beings are like this, they're not a bit jealous, and many thought we can do that ourselves. And if you, and then never developed something which gave really a fundamental, interesting, attractive perspective. There was this cooperation agreement between the European Union and Russia. This simply expired at the end of 2009 or something, without any further idea.
Okay, thank you, Jim.
Yeah, but that is, I'm not, this is important to understand, because you cannot understand the enlargement by the consequences, with security and economics always, I think, are in a context. And that is important, I think, to see.
Thanks, Johannes. Just the what lost Russia, when prior to Clinton's first meeting with Yeltsin in April of '93, he gave a speech about why the United States needed, the US Congress needed to support assistance to Russia. And he talked about the three transitions Russia was going through, from authoritarianism to democracy, from communism to capitalism, and from an imperial state to a post-imperial state. The problem was the latter, because it didn't happen. Yeltsin recognized the other republics in late '91 because it was what he needed to do politically was defeat Gorbachev, and to defeat Gorbachev, well, you got to bring the Soviet Union down. You got to recognize the other republics. So his political strategy involved Russia accepting the independence of these other states. And worth noting that the two other people, Yeltsin, signed the early December accords with
Just died.
Kravchuk and Shishkevich,
yeah,
just
yeah.
passed away within the past week.
He also,
But even,
he also signs the Budapest memorandum.
Right, yes. But there was a limit, even to Yeltsin in 1997, in the run-up to the Madrid summit announcing the invitations to new members in the NATO-Russia Founding Act. Yeltsin asked Clinton for an agreement that no former Soviet republics would come into NATO, and especially Ukraine. And Clinton said, I can't do that. And he said to Yeltsin, that's not what you should want from Russia either, because, again, sort of got back to that argument about Russia as an imperial state. And when I look at the statements about isolating and weakening Russia so it can't do to Ukraine again what it's done now, I read that as you did not choose to become a post-imperial state, so we are going to make you become a post-imperial state. Will that work? I don't know. But to me, that has been the central problem from the beginning. It was even getting back to the Partnership for Peace question. I mean, this was always one of the problems of any of these fora, was that what the Russians wanted was US-Russia dialogue. Like the idea that they would have to sit in some meeting and they would just be, same level as Estonia. I mean, that was not appealing to them.
And the qualification as a regional power, remember that?
Yes.
Yeah, that was really exactly what you said.
So I think that to me, that's still the central challenge.
So two questions left. So let's group Marissa and Chip.
Okay, just two sort of naive, but perhaps summary sort of questions. If Ukraine and Georgia had been made members of NATO, would we be in a different situation? And alternatively, was it yes or no? Like you said that that's a mistake, but could we have done it in an appropriate way? Because when I listen to you talk about Central and Eastern Europe, can't the same thing be said? There's no drives, no lines. As Clinton said, I can't do that. So what would have been the right way at that time what would have been the appropriate response at that time?
All right, Chip.
Just a couple of points, Jim. When I think about the debate, the internal debate over what to do about NATO expansion and Russia, seems to me there were three groupings. There was the Perry-Shawley grouping, as you said, where Partnership for Peace, they talked about it both openly and privately as in place of, right? Not to say that, NATO expansion couldn't ultimately take place, blah, 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 but they conceived of it as a way to slow walk the whole debate, which they thought was getting in the way of bigger questions, as you know, right? So this was kind of there. And that had some bureaucratic weight to it. At the other extreme within the administration, as you know, was just slam the door on the Russians, right? They're done. They're not moving. Yes, we should continue to try, but we're not going to give them veto power over anything we do. That would be really stupid. And that was the view of the National Security Advisor at the time. And then there was a group kind of in the middle that said, well, we have to come up with something better than Partnership for Peace. And I don't think we should base policy with Russia on an antagonistic, necessarily antagonistic foundation. But you have to do something about what you just referenced, which was a huge paradigmatic piece of this, which was politics like nature abhors a vacuum. And if we leave Eastern and Central Europe, Central and Eastern Europe untended it's a formula for disaster, because at some point in time, the Russians are going to wake up, they're going to realize they lost the Cold War, they're going to externalize responsibility, which every polity does, and says, this was part of a masterful American design to weaken Russia. So, right? I mean, that was the argument, and that was the link between those three pieces. But that was very contentious, as you know, internally, and it wasn't resolved until December of 1994, right, in the White House meetings, right? And then Perry said to me afterwards, I was not there for that one, I came later, but Perry said to me, someone still has to explain to me how that was a decision, because I didn't hear it as a decision. It's really interesting.
Right.
But those, as I think about trying to combine those three threads, those are the big themes. And we went back and forth between and among those themes. And some of us, as you know, some of us had the unfortunate responsibility of trying to weave those three things together and then make them coherent and then communicate that coherently to the president. So that's that point. There's an interesting sidebar to the Kosovo business. I have no doubt that it was the British general who said to Wes, I'm not going to start World War III. There was also a démarche that came from our side that said, in essence, to Yeltsin, if you don't give the order to stop that advance, you're endangering all of the progress we've made in the bilateral relationship, and we can't guarantee that we'll be able to start over again in a positive spot. It was a very sharp warning shot, which I think had a lot to do with slowing the Russians up.
Thanks. So, so what about Ukraine, Georgia? And then maybe I'll just say a word about Sweden and Finland. I mean, as I said, your point I think is absolutely correct, which is, where do you draw a line and why? Given an institution that's committed to an open door from its founding. And that's why I think that NATO has refused to formally close the door to any country that would be eligible under Article 10 if it could meet what's laid out in Article 10. I think for NATO, politically as an institution, it just does not want to formally close the door in a way that goes against that Article 10. And that's why in response to the Russian demands of December, it reiterated that there was an open door. Now, I think, Steve Piper, made the point that, the policy, there should have been a way to come up with an agreement on language that basically signaled not now, but not never. And I think if Putin had been interested, that could have been done. That was just diplomatic language that had to be done. But I don't think there was no pressure in 2008 to do what was done. Ukraine and Georgia were members of Partnership for Peace. I mean, you could have continued to stall the issue. You could have continued to find ways to work with them without so overtly putting the membership issue on the table. And I think that's what would have been preferable. Now, of course, the most interesting thing that's happened in NATO in a long time with respect to this issue of enlargement is the fact that countries that you never would have imagined joining are now saying that they would like to be members. And I think, unless we get some big surprise like the Hungarians deciding not to ratify Swedish and Finnish membership, I think we will within the year have 32 members of the alliance rather than 30. And I think it's hugely important and hugely interesting. People are focused on the long border with Russia. I think the more important things are, you're talking about countries with, especially Finland, with heft. We've taken a lot of small countries into the alliance in recent years. They don't do a lot for NATO as a military alliance. There's not a lot you can contribute there. I mean, this is serious, taking serious countries in with respect to being members of NATO. And it really changes the landscape for the Baltics. I mean, Northern Europe is just dramatically different with Sweden and Finland joining. And it has a hugely positive effect on the Baltic countries. So I think this is, never would have expected it. It's all due to Russian aggression. And I think that it will be good for the alliance to have those two countries in.
All right, thank you so much for this really fascinating talk. Thank you everyone for your great questions.
Thanks for inviting me.